24 that we are going to go ahead and get into is the freighter that struck an object in Lake Superior.
A freighter carrying iron ore is taking on water in Lake Superior. The Coast Guard says the ship hit something underwater just before 7 o'clock this morning, about 35 miles southwest of Royale, Michigan. That's an island closer to Minnesota near the U.S.-Canadian border. Half of the crew has been evacuated for safety. The ship is 689 feet long. It is now on its way to a port for inspection and repairs.
So what is so strange about this story? Because ships can sink, they can collide with things. That's not a conspiracy. But back on June of 2024, the United States Coast Guard received a report at 6:53 in the morning from the 689 Michipicoten that they collided with something underwater and are taking on water. And this was approximately 35 miles southwest of Isle Royale, Lake Superior. Where they were 35 miles out is a good distance. That would mean by that distance, Lake Superior would be very deep, rolling out any rocks. It is also very important to note that the crew on the Michipicoten were experienced, and they also used the word elided, which is very important, because the word elided is a nautical term meaning to strike a stationary object. Researching this further, Lake Superior is the world's largest freshwater lake. It also is the coldest and deepest of the Great Lakes with a maximum depth of 1,332 feet. Again, it's huge. The ship had departed from Two Harbors, Minnesota on Friday, bound for Thunder Bay in Canada, when it received a 13-foot gash shortly before 7 a.m. The crew was forced to use water pumps to displace the floodwater. Their actions managed to reduce the listing from 15 degrees to 5 degrees by 9:15 a.m. And still by that time, they were still using the word elided. They still believe they collided with a stationary object. The United States Coast Guard of the Great Lakes sent out this tweet, again confirming that the Michipicoten did indeed collide with a stationary object. The Michipicoten was carrying low-grade iron ore taconite, and as time progressed, the story would slowly change. But the very next day, that Saturday, the cause of the flooding was still unknown. By all accounts, they still could not find the object that they smashed into that caused a 13-foot gash in the ship. Lauren Thomas, the Externals Affairs Division Chief for the 9th Coast Guard District, was quoted as saying that investigators will probe whether the hull was damaged by running aground, hitting a fixed or floating object, suffering a hull failure, or perhaps a combination of various factors. Even these news agencies started to notice that the story was slowly beginning to change, because they would put in their articles earlier, the United States Coast Guard of the Great Lakes said that the ship had struck something underwater. What's even more curious is that there were articles that came out, and there were a couple of interviews that came out that stated that the ship, before it made this collision, actually diverted off of its course. And then this was never expanded upon. There was no follow-ups as to why this ship had diverted.
That was a 1,000-foot ship that diverted off of its track.
As time was still progressing and the story was making its way around the airways and still yet no plausible answer, of course people are going to begin to speculate, and they did. The incident has sparked speculation online about the possible unidentified submerged object, the USO, the nautical equivalent of a UFO. Users on X posted various theories online, many of them tongue-in-cheek, as they discussed the incident. The water 35 miles southwest of Isle Royale is 600 feet deep. I wonder what the Michipicoten collided with underwater, one wrote. Another commentator responded, maybe Elon's rescue sub, referring to a submarine created by mogul Elon Musk. Another suggested the bottom of the lake was a watery graveyard for abandoned cars. So again, a lot of people were talking, coming up with different theories. News agencies were also interested in this story, sending emails out to the Coast Guard for further answers. And we can't forget that the Great Lakes also have a lot of mysteriousness and strangeness that surrounds them. A lot of odd stories come out of the Great Lakes. This story was also a couple months after the anomaly on Beauvais Island that kept appearing. You can see this news article here that says it's not the first time that a USO mystery has gripped ocean fans. In April, a wave modeling website suggested a huge underwater object was moving at incredible speeds alongside the African coast. There was also an object that kept appearing over Lake Michigan as well. As more time then progressed and there still wasn't any answers, this is where we started to hear something different. Lieutenant Joe Snyder of the United States Coast Guard came out and said an underwater collision still can't be 100% ruled out, but the gash in the ship's hull is likely due to a stress fracture. None of the crew members on the Michipicoten ever gave a public statement as to what happened. The only ones speaking on the subject were high up in the United States Coast Guard, and at that time the damaged Michipicoten was laid up at Kiefer Terminal in Thunder Bay. Investigators from the United States and Canada were trying to figure out what went wrong, and they were investigating it further, but still, to this day, there's never been an answer as to what happened to this ship. They say it's very likely that it was a stress fracture from the taconite, but they're not 100% sure, and if it did indeed hit something, they don't know what that something is or was. One would think that this experienced crew on the Michipicoten would know the difference between a stress fracture and colliding with a stationary object. With there being no concrete answers, and the way this story was swept under the rug and forgotten about, the crew members not being able to speak on the subject, a lot of people feel like the ship collided with a UFO, or perhaps an enemy submarine, or something else altogether that exists under Lake Superior that they don't want us to know actually exist. Because again, a couple weeks prior to this story, this massive object was seen on radar over Lake Michigan. So is it possible this same object traveled over to Lake Superior, or perhaps another one of these objects exists under Lake Superior, whatever this object could be? But here's something even more interesting. The Michipicoten may have collided with something, because it's never been confirmed, on June 8th, 2024. On that exact same day, 2 kayakers went missing on Lake Superior. That is right, very interesting coincidence. This article was published on June 8th, 2024, and it says, the search for 2 people who went missing Saturday afternoon, June 8th, after a boat capsized in Keweenaw Bay resumed Monday morning. The Michigan State Police says its Marine Services unit located the capsized boat and both missing people involved with it Monday afternoon. The victims were deceased and located in an area nearly 220 feet in depth in Lake Superior. No more came from this story either. Nobody knows what caused this boat to capsize. There was actually a fishing tournament taking place that same day, and the waters were fine. Only hours after the Michipicoten perhaps collided with something on Lake Superior, this boat capsizes and both people on board lose their lives. There is also something strange about this news story when it comes to the numerology as well, that makes me feel like there's something more at play here than meets the eye. On the Michipicoten itself, the ship, there were exactly 22 crew members. The 2 individuals that had capsized, well, there was 2 of them, and they were found exactly in 220 feet of water. What is up with all the 2s? And there have been no more updates to either story. Let's go ahead and move on with our next bizarre news story of 2024, and this would be the strange case of Kyle Effinger.
Officers found him unconscious inside the engine's intake cowling.
And that there was a medical emergency on the de-icing pad, and then the police showed up.
Across the tarmac, Nelson used her cell phone to zoom in on the body she saw lying underneath the engine.
As a nurse, I know what it looks like when people are doing compressions. When I looked out the window and I zoomed in, I could see somebody going up and down.
She says first responders did CPR for about 20 minutes.
They put his body into an ambulance, and the ambulance didn't drive away. And I know that if that happens, then they're no longer living.
She flies out of Salt Lake International often.
It's a big airport, and there's a lot of people coming in and out, and I don't know how they don't have more security breaches.
She calls the incident bizarre and said she's sorry for Effinger's family.
Kind of makes you wonder what happened.
This story is odd for a couple of reasons. For one, Kyle Effinger, 30, of Park City, passed away on New Year's Day after climbing into the turbine of an aircraft which was awaiting takeoff at Salt Lake City International Airport with 100 people on board. Now the thing is, they say they found him inside the turbine, the engine of the plane. Now if that was the case, they would not find anything left of Kyle Effinger. There have been many stories that have come out of maintenance workers being sucked into the engines, into the turbine blades of the planes, and they are basically reduced to soup. They're that powerful. While any plane is waiting for takeoff, the engines are definitely on. So that being said, the question happens to be, how were police, investigators, and rescuers able to find Kyle Effinger's body in one piece and still alive when he basically should have been reduced to particles? This is the video footage that has come out of Kyle Effinger inside the airport acting very erratic. Now, prior to this, prior to him running out to the terminal, there was other news that had come out that people noticed that he was located in other terminals acting very erratic as well. So the question happens to be, where was security? So as you can see on the camera, you can see Kyle Effinger acting erratic, but what's even more interesting is towards the end, you can see the plane inching towards him as he's running on the tarmac, and that's where the camera stops. We never once see Kyle getting inside any plane's engine, or if this is the plane, and again, it's on and moving, he would have been just completely sucked up inside the engine and nothing left. But as you heard in the first news clip, this lady saw police working on him. She saw somebody down on the ground, and he must have passed away inside the ambulance. We never actually see Effinger's family on video, but news tells us that, and they are quoting the family, Effinger's family believes the incident stemmed from a mental health crisis while he was about to fly to Denver to see his sick grandfather. He got held up in security, missed his flight, and those phone calls, I just knew it was coming on. They call it the manic phase. Those just don't end well for him, and this is Fox News quoting Judd Effinger, who would be Kyle's father. Kyle's father supposedly said, obviously, this one the worst ever. So the story concluded with Kyle Effinger was just mentally ill. But this New York Post article continues to say that Effinger was found partially inside a wing-mounted engine of the plane after the manager of an airport store reported a disturbance on the secured side of the terminal just before 10 p.m. that night. The Airbus A220-100 was being de-iced before flying to San Francisco, officials also said.